By mid-1944, the war in the Pacific had become a furnace. The United States was pushing westward, island by island, toward the Japanese homeland. Every new landing meant a smaller island, a tougher garrison, and a bloodier fight. When the Marines came ashore on Saipan that June, they brought with them something Japan had not yet faced in the Pacific theater on such a scale: tanks. Not the lumbering steel monsters that fought across the plains of Europe, but amphibious, salt-scarred machines forged for coral, sand, and jungle. The M4 Sherman, America's workhorse of war, was about to meet the Empire's last armored defenders, the Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chiha, in a confrontation that would prove as brutal as it was unequal. The Sherman was never designed for the tropics. Its steel body had been built for Europe's fields and deserts, not volcanic ash and tangled vines. Yet the Marines knew they needed armor that could land directly on a beach, crush through bunkers, and survive mines, artillery, and suicidal attacks. On the decks of landing ship tanks, crews waterproofed their vehicles, wrapped exhausts in rubberized canvas, and prayed that the Pacific surf wouldn't swallow them whole. When the ramps dropped, they drove straight into chaos. Waves slamming against the hull, bullets sparking off armor, sand clogging treads as engines howled under strain. Across the water, Japanese officers watched in disbelief. From their vantage points on Saipan's cliffs, they saw American tanks, hundreds of them, rolling off ships and through the surf like beasts from the sea. To the Japanese, the Sherman was an unnatural sight. Their own armor, the light Hago and medium Chiha, had been designed for China's plains and Manchuria's steppe. Fast, lightly armed, and thinly protected. In the Pacific, they were obsolete. Yet they remained symbols of national pride, and their crews faced the impossible with characteristic resolve. When Japan's 2nd Tank Regiment prepared to defend Saipan, their commander, Colonel Goto, told his men, "Our tanks will not return. We will die as samurai of steel." They had no illusions about victory. Their 57mm and 47mm guns could barely scratch the Sherman's frontal armor, while the American 75mm could pierce a Chiha from over 1,000 yards. Still, the Japanese planned to use surprise, terrain, and darkness to their advantage. They would not meet the enemy in open battle but in ambush among the caves, forests, and ridges that had already swallowed entire battalions. The contrast between the two armies went deeper than technology. It was industrial civilization against imperial desperation. The United States could land an entire armored battalion with fresh fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts within hours. Japan's tanks, by contrast, had to be ferried piecemeal to the islands before the American blockade closed in. Once they were deployed, there was no resupply, no retreat. Every engagement was a fight to the death, a single, final charge for the Emperor. As the first Shermans crawled inland on Saipan, they quickly discovered the Pacific's true enemy, the terrain. Razor-sharp coral chewed through their tracks, and thick mud turned every advance into an ordeal. Tropical heat warped rubber seals and overheated engines, while Japanese artillery zeroed in on the narrow beaches. The jungle itself became an adversary. Every tree could hide a gun, every cave a suicide squad. Marines had to adapt, learning to fight side by side with tanks in an environment that defied the logic of conventional warfare. To the men inside the Shermans, combat on Saipan felt claustrophobic and surreal. The narrow jungle paths left no room to maneuver. Tanks advanced single file, each one vulnerable to mines, satchel charges, and hidden gunners. Japanese infantry swarmed from spider holes, tossing grenades onto engine decks or crawling beneath the treads with expletives strapped to their chests. Tank commanders learned to keep their hatches sealed even in suffocating heat. One lapse could mean a grenade thrown through the opening. In response, Marines armed with flamethrowers followed close behind, purging bunkers and tunnels in waves of fire. It was brutal, intimate warfare, steel and flesh clashing in the smoke and screams of the tropics. Despite these horrors, the Shermans kept advancing. Their 75mm guns blasted through palm trunks and concrete pillboxes alike, while their machine guns scythed through counterattacks. Every few miles, another Japanese position fell, but the defenders refused to surrender. In one of the most desperate counterattacks of the war, over 40 Japanese tanks and hundreds of infantry charged the American lines under the cover of night. The battle turned the plains of Saipan into a blazing sea of fire. Sherman after Sherman lit up the darkness with muzzle flashes, each shot finding its mark. By dawn, the field was littered with burning Chihas, their turrets blown open, their crews dead inside. For the Marines who watched,
It was both awe-inspiring and horrific. They had seen courage before, but never such futile sacrifice. They drove straight into hell, and they didn't stop until every tank was burning. The Battle of Saipan ended Japan's last organized armored force in the Central Pacific. Yet the experience hardened both sides, the Americans in their determination to finish the job, the Japanese in their belief that dying in battle was the only honor left. As Saipan fell, preparations began for the next assaults: Tinian, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Each would be deadlier, each more fortified, each fought in terrain where tanks were never meant to go. But by then, the Sherman was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol of endurance, of a nation that could turn steel and fuel into victory, and of crews who refused to stop, even when the jungle itself seemed to rise against them. For Japan, the battle marked the beginning of the end. Their tanks, once the pride of an empire, were now relics of a past era, outmatched and outgunned. Yet their crews still fought on, guided by a warrior code that valued honor over survival. The stage was set for the final chapters, when the Sherman would evolve into a weapon of fire and the Pacific Islands would burn under the roar of flamethrowers and the scream of the dying empire.
When the first Shermans rolled onto Saipan's coral beaches in mid-1944, it became immediately clear that the Pacific was unlike any battlefield America had faced. In Europe, tanks fought across roads, hedgerows, and open plains. In the Pacific, they were expected to climb out of the sea, crawl over volcanic rock, and blast through caves carved into the earth itself. The U.S. Marine Corps and Navy engineers had to transform a medium tank built for speed and range into a machine that could survive in salt water, sand, and suffocating heat. What followed was one of the most remarkable mechanical evolutions of the war, the rebirth of the M4 Sherman as an amphibious assault weapon. It began on the shipyards of Hawaii and the workshops of Pearl Harbor. Mechanics improvised solutions with whatever they could find: canvas, rubber, welding torches, and raw ingenuity. They sealed the tank's air intakes and exhausts with rubber gaskets, added extended wading stacks to the engine deck, and waterproofed electrical systems that were never designed to meet the ocean. The transformation turned the Sherman into a wading tank, capable of plunging off a landing craft into several feet of surf and crawling ashore under fire. The Marines nicknamed them amphibious Shermans, ungainly, salt-encrusted beasts that looked half-drowned but fought like demons once they hit solid ground. But the engineers didn't stop there. To support island invasions that had no harbors, they created hybrids of tank and boat, the LVT-A4 amphibious assault vehicles. These Amtraks, fitted with a 75mm howitzer in an open turret, were the first true swimming tanks, capable of crossing lagoons and delivering direct fire the moment their treads touched coral. Each carried Marines or supplies into zones where waves and reefs had crippled earlier assaults. They were slow and thinly armored, but their presence changed amphibious warfare forever. Even more innovative were the flamethrower conversions that emerged from the Pacific campaigns. On Tarawa and the Marshalls, Japanese soldiers had proven that no conventional shell could root them out of caves or pillboxes carved into coral. Engineers in Hawaii and the Marianas began replacing the Sherman's coaxial machine gun or main gun with a flamethrower system. The first of these, the M4A3R3 Satan, mounted a naval pattern flame projector in the 75mm gun mount, carrying 200 gallons of napalm mixture in internal tanks. When fired, it could unleash a stream of fire 150 feet long, enough to engulf a bunker in seconds. Later variants, refined on the battlefield, became the M4A3R8 Zippo, named after the famous lighter. What had begun as a desperate experiment became the most feared weapon in the Pacific. These modifications reflected more than mechanical adaptation. They represented a new philosophy of war. The Pacific Campaign demanded machines that could move, shoot, and survive in environments where every element, water, terrain, heat, even the smell of decay, conspired to destroy them. The Shermans that landed on Saipan, Tinian, and later Iwo Jima were covered in improvised armor, steel plates scavenged from wrecks, sandbags welded to hulls, track links bolted over vulnerable spots.
Some crews draped spare treads over the turret like chainmail. Others carried improvised wire cutters welded to the bow to clear jungle vines. No two tanks looked alike. They were as individual as the men who drove them. Inside the armored hull, conditions bordered on unbearable. The tropical heat turned the tank into an oven. Crewmen often stripped to undershirts, the metal floor so hot that ammunition casings burned their hands. Sweat soaked every surface and the air reeked of oil, cordite, and human exhaustion. But the Sherman was forgiving. Its Continental R975 radial engine, a 9-cylinder aircraft derivative, could run on low-octane fuel and still deliver 400 horsepower. It could keep moving on one track, limp with a broken suspension, even crawl forward with half its road wheels missing. For the Marines, that reliability was priceless. If it could breathe, it could fight. The Japanese watching from the caves and cliffs quickly realized that these tanks were not like the ponderous machines they had seen in the Philippines or China. The Shermans moved in tight cooperation with infantry and bulldozers, forming armored spearheads that chewed through obstacles. Behind them, flamethrower variants followed to finish what the shells began. To the defenders, the combination of fire and steel was apocalyptic. They began calling the American tanks Oni-kuruma, or demon carts. Still, the learning curve was steep and costly. Early landings saw many Shermans drown in the surf or stall in soft coral. On Saipan's beaches, tank after tank bogged down before reaching firm ground. Crews learned the hard way to deflate tracks for traction, to waterproof hatches more carefully, to signal the Navy for precise timing between waves. Every island became a classroom. By the time the Marines hit Tinian in late July 1944, the coordination between amphibious tanks, LVTs, engineers, and infantry was seamless, a symphony of mechanized warfare executed on strips of sand barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. As the campaign advanced toward the Japanese homeland, these adaptations turned the Sherman from a general-purpose tank into a weapon of specialization, a tool for exterminating strongpoints in a hostile, alien world. When the engineers at Pearl Harbor received after-action reports describing how flamethrower Shermans cleared caves and burned bunkers from within, they redoubled their efforts. Soon, entire companies of flame tanks were assigned to Marine divisions. The line between tank and flamethrower blurred until they became one and the same, a mobile inferno built to erase resistance where bullets failed. By late 1944, the Pacific Sherman had become a legend among its crews. It was not the fastest, nor the strongest, nor even the prettiest of tanks, but it was the one that came back. Its treads carried the scars of coral and shrapnel, its holes were blackened by flame and sea prey. To the men who fought in them, these machines were not symbols of glory, they were survival itself. And as they prepared for the battles to come, the black sands of Iwo Jima and the ridges of Okinawa, they knew that the next chapter would demand every ounce of ingenuity the Sherman still had left to give.
The sun rose over Saipan on June 17, 1944, through a haze of smoke and dust that smelled of oil, blood, and burned coral. The beaches, that only days before had been bright white, now glowed red in the morning light. In the distance, the thunder of naval guns rolled endlessly, shaking the very ground beneath the tanks that waited for their orders. For the first time in the Pacific, the M4 Sherman would face an enemy armored force of equal determination, if not equal power. This was the island where America's most successful tank would earn its Pacific baptism, and where Japan's last armored regiments would burn themselves out in a final act of defiance. The Marines had landed in waves, men, machines, and metal pouring from the sea in an unstoppable tide. On D-Day alone, more than 8,000 Marines and 30 Sherman tanks had established a tenuous beachhead. Behind them, the ocean boiled with the chaos of war, LSTs disgorging vehicles into the surf, landing craft smashing against reefs, and corpsmen dragging wounded men through waist-deep water. The Shermans, their engines screaming under strain, crawled forward through the sand, treads churning coral to dust. Some made it ashore, others sank, slipping beneath the waves before they ever fired a shot.
Waiting inland was Colonel Goto's 9th Tank Regiment, a veteran formation from Manchuria, armed with about 44 tanks, mostly Type 97 Chiha and Type 95 Hago models. They were relics by European standards, their thin armor barely half an inch thick, their 57mm guns obsolete. But to the men who crewed them, they were sacred. The tanks were blessed in a ceremony before battle, incense smoke curling around the rising sun flags painted on their turrets. Their orders were simple: destroy the invaders or die trying. The first major tank battle of the Pacific began before dawn on June 17th. The Japanese tanks advanced through the cane fields and coconut groves, their engines muffled by the jungle. The Sherman's crews, huddled in their steel coffins, saw movement in the dark and opened fire. Tracers streaked through the humid air, tearing holes in the foliage. The Japanese responded, their 47mm guns spitting sparks that bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's frontal armor but punched through thinner side plates when they could flank. In moments, the fields erupted into chaos: flames, exploding shells, the shriek of ricochets. The Sherman's 75mm guns answered with devastating effect, their armor-piercing shells slicing through the Chiha like paper. One Marine tank commander, Sergeant William Banks, later described the fight. "They came at us in a wave, right out of the trees. I counted at least 15 of them before we fired the first round. We hit 3 in the first minute. The rest kept coming, even burning. I'd never seen anything like it." As daylight grew, the full extent of the Japanese attack became clear. More than 40 tanks and hundreds of infantry charged in a coordinated assault towards the beachhead. It was a suicidal gamble designed to drive the Americans into the sea before they could dig in. Instead, it became a massacre. The Shermans fired at point-blank range, their guns glowing red-hot. Naval artillery joined in, shells screaming overhead. When it was over, the field was strewn with wreckage, torn steel, shattered turrets, and the bodies of men who had fought to the last breath. The Americans counted at least 31 enemy tanks destroyed. The rest had simply vanished into smoke. The 2nd Tank Regiment of Japan was effectively annihilated. Colonel Goto's last radio message was a brief, calm transmission. "We are dying for the Emperor. Long live the Empire." Then silence. But victory on Saipan came at a terrible cost. The terrain that swallowed Japan's tanks now turned against the Americans. The surviving defenders retreated into hills honeycombed with caves, tunnels, and hidden bunkers. The Shermans, designed for movement and maneuver, found themselves in a nightmare of narrow paths and invisible enemies. Every ridge was mined, every cave filled with soldiers willing to die rather than surrender. The Marines quickly adapted. Flamethrower Shermans were brought forward. M4A3R3s fitted with naval Mark I flame units. These tanks, nicknamed Satans, became the terror of Saipan. They advanced alongside bulldozers that filled trenches and sealed cave mouths, their nozzles spraying arcs of fire into the dark openings. Japanese soldiers tried to flee, but the jungle itself caught fire. It wasn't war, it was hell in daylight. On neighboring Tinian, the battle was shorter but no less fierce. The island was smaller, flatter, and better suited for armored tactics. Here, the Shermans worked in perfect coordination with infantry and naval air support. The Marines perfected a new rhythm. Tanks would move ahead in pairs, one firing while the other covered, while flamethrower variants burned out bunkers that resisted shell fire. The Japanese counterattacks, though brave, broke against this wall of fire and steel. The climax came at dawn on July 24th, when over 100 Japanese soldiers charged with explosives strapped to their bodies, aiming to destroy the tanks. They were cut down in minutes by tank-mounted machine guns. A single Sherman could unleash a hurricane of lead, 2 30-caliber Brownings, 1 50 caliber on the turret, and the main gun for anything larger. When the smoke cleared, the beach was littered with bodies. By the end of the Marianas Campaign, the U.S. had lost dozens of Shermans to mines, artillery, and suicide squads, but Japan had lost something greater, its last hope of armored resistance. The Chi-Ha and Haga were gone, replaced only by static guns and the grim determination of infantry. For the first time, American tankers in the Pacific began to feel what German crews had felt years earlier in Russia, a sense that no matter how fierce the defense, the tide of industry was unstoppable. Yet, amid the triumph, there was unease. The Marines knew the next battle would be worse. The Japanese were learning too. Their new fortifications on Iwo Jima and Okinawa were being carved deeper, reinforced with concrete and steel, designed to resist everything short of annihilation. For the tank crews who had survived Saipan and Tinian, the question was no longer whether they could win, but how many of them would live long enough to see victory. On Saipan's plains, the wrecks of Shermans and Chi-Has still smoldered as the Pacific wind blew through their twisted hulks. The battles of Saipan and Tinian had proven one thing beyond doubt. In the jungles and beaches of the Pacific, the war had become not just a contest of armies, but of endurance. And the Sherman, scorched, battered, yet still moving, was the instrument of that endurance.
By early 1945, the Pacific War had turned into a relentless grind of attrition. The victories at Saipan and Tinian had brought American forces within bomber range of Japan, but the cost in lives and machines was staggering. The next objectives, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, would be worse. Both islands were fortresses, their terrain shaped by volcanic rock and reinforced concrete, riddled with tunnels and gun pits, invisible from the air. For the Marines, it was clear that infantry alone could not break those defenses. The war would now depend on firepower, and in the Pacific, that meant the Sherman. The Battle of Iwo Jima, beginning on February 19, 1945, was the most intense armored campaign the Marine Corps had ever fought. The island was barely 8 square miles, but it was defended by more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers dug into 16 miles of underground tunnels. Their commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, forbade suicide charges. Instead, his men would stay hidden until the Americans were close enough to kill. It was an entirely new kind of defense, one designed to make every inch of the island a death trap. The first Shermans rolled ashore on Iwo Jima just hours after the initial landings. Their arrival was a triumph of engineering and courage. Amphibious LSTs opened their doors in the surf, and the Kanks lumbered forward through volcanic ash so soft it swallowed their tracks. Engines screamed under strain, treads spun uselessly, and several vehicles sank into the black sand within minutes. Others made it to the beach, only to be hit by hidden artillery that seemed to come from the ground itself. Within the first day, more than a dozen tanks were knocked out, some by mines, others by precise anti-tank fire that struck from concealed positions. But the survivors adapted quickly. Working alongside engineers and flamethrower teams, the Shermans began carving a path inland. Their guns blasted caves open, while specialized flamethrower variants, M4A3R8 Zippos, followed to finish the job. Each carried nearly 300 gallons of napalm mixture, capable of spitting fire more than 150 feet. The effect was devastating. In the labyrinth of tunnels where bullets and grenades meant nothing, fire became the only weapon that could truly destroy the defenders. When a cave entrance erupted into flame, the heat was so intense that nearby Marines could feel it through their uniforms. Tank crews on Iwo Jima quickly learned that no 2 yards of ground were the same. The one minute the terrain was flat and open, the next it dropped into craters or rose into ragged ridges. The island's volcanic dust clogged filters and scorched engines, while Japanese gunners zeroed in on every movement. Crews welded spared tracks and sandbags to their hulls, hoping to survive a few extra seconds when the inevitable shell found them. Inside the tanks, the noise was deafening, the air choking with fumes. Communication was done by banging on the hull or shouting through intercoms that often failed under vibration. Still, the Shermans pressed forward. They supported infantry at the base of Mount Suribachi, firing point-blank into pillboxes and bunkers. One Sherman named Courageous reportedly destroyed 17 enemy positions in a single day before being hit and abandoned.
The tank's crew survived and joined nearby infantry, but their machine continued to burn for 2 days, an immobile monument to the hell of Iwo Jima. The same pattern repeated weeks later at Okinawa, but on an even larger scale. The island, nearly 70 miles long, became the stage for the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. When the Americans landed on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, they faced more than 120,000 Japanese troops and Okinawan conscripts entrenched in the hills of Shuri and the ridges of the south. It was no longer just a battle for territory. It was Japan's final stand before invasion. The Marines and the Army brought with them nearly 800 tanks, Shermans, flamethrower variants, and amphibious LVTA-4s. The island's mud and rain turned every road into a river, but the tanks pushed on, engines roaring, treads clattering through water and wreckage. The Japanese defenders had learned from previous campaigns. They let the Americans advance unopposed, then unleashed hell. Hidden anti-tank guns, 47mm, and even captured U.S. 37mm pieces tore into the advancing armor from point-blank range. Infantry swarmed with magnetic mines and satchel charges, sacrificing themselves to stop the tanks. In response, the Shermans and Zippos unleashed a storm of fire. Whole ridge lines went up in flames as tanks torched caves and trenches. The combination of high-explosive shells and napalm broke even the most stubborn defenses. One Marine observer described it as a war beneath the ground, only the fire reached them. At Shuri's castle, the symbolic heart of Japanese resistance on Okinawa, Sherman supported infantry assaults that finally captured the position after weeks of brutal fighting. The tank's 75mm shells reduced ancient walls to rubble, their flamethrowers clearing bunkers hidden within. The toll on both sides was staggering. More than 12,000 Americans were killed or missing on Okinawa, and nearly all of the Japanese defenders died, some by their own hand rather than surrender. The Sherman crews who survived were haunted by what they had seen: the screams of burning soldiers, the stench of charred earth, the endless rain turning battlefields into graves. Many wrote afterward that they never wanted to see another flame tank again. Yet they knew those same weapons had saved thousands of Marines from dying in frontal assaults against impregnable defenses. When Okinawa finally fell in June 1945, the Sherman had become more than a machine of war. It was a symbol of endurance, adaptation, and firepower unmatched in the Pacific. From the beaches of Tarawa to the hills of Okinawa, it had evolved from a standard tank into a family of specialized weapons: amphibious, flame, engineering, and command variants. Each carried the marks of ingenuity born from necessity. Japanese survivors of Okinawa later told Allied interrogators that the Sherman's flamethrowers terrified them more than anything else. We could face bullets, we could face bombs, but we could not face the fire. It came into the caves, it ate the air. For the Americans, the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were the final crucibles of mechanized warfare in the Pacific. They had proven that even in the most inhospitable terrain, technology, teamwork, and sheer persistence could overcome fanaticism. The cost, however, was unbearable. Tankers, infantrymen, and engineers alike carried the memories of those blackened caves and burning ridges for the rest of their lives. As the last Shermans rumbled to a halt on Okinawa's devastated plains, the crews could not know that the war's end was only weeks away. They only knew that they had survived when so many had not. Their tanks, once painted olive drab, were now scorched black and pitted with shrapnel. Yet still, they ran, testament to the machine that refused to die and the men who refused to stop fighting.
When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the tanks that had carried the Marines from Tarawa to Okinawa sat idle amid the wreckage of a world reshaped by fire. The M4 Sherman, once dismissed as a stopgap design, had become a symbol of industrial endurance and tactical flexibility. Yet in the Pacific, its story was not just about steel and firepower. It was about how technology, courage, and adaptation together rewrote the rules of war. In the final months before Japan's surrender, the Sherman stood ready for an invasion that never came. The planned assault on the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, would have been the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Allied planners estimated nearly 1 million casualties on both sides. To prepare, the U.S. had gathered more than 10,000 tanks across the Pacific, including hundreds of Shermans modified for Japan's terrain, waterproofed for surf, flame-equipped for caves, and armed with high-velocity 76mm guns to counter whatever last-ditch defenses the Empire might deploy. But on August 6 and 9, 1945, two B-29 super fortresses, Enola Gay and Boxcar, dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In an instant, the invasion became unnecessary. Japan capitulated, and the Shermans that had survived Iwo Jima and Okinawa were left without a final battlefield. Many crews felt relief. Others felt unfinished. "We'd fought across every island," one Marine tank commander wrote, "but the war ended before we could bring the fire to their doorstep." When the occupation began, Shermans rolled through the shattered streets of Yokosuka and Tokyo, not as conquerors, but as witnesses to the end of an empire. The Japanese people, who had once viewed American armor as lumbering and primitive, now watched in silence as these machines, scarred, dented, and soot-streaked, idled among the ruins of their cities. A tank that had once been mocked as a clumsy iron box had outlasted every weapon Japan had thrown against it. The strategic importance of the Sherman in the Pacific cannot be overstated. It was not the decisive weapon by itself, but it was the bridge between land and sea, between infantry and engineers, between innovation and survival. Every Pacific Island assault was a logistical nightmare. Coral reefs blocked landing craft, volcanic terrain ate engines, and rain turned battlefields into rivers of mud. Yet the Sherman kept fighting, often repaired in the field with salvaged parts, coconuts plugging leaks, and wire holding armor plates in place. It wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol of American adaptability, a machine that could be rebuilt anywhere, by anyone, and still perform. Its role also extended far beyond combat effectiveness. The Sherman became a lesson in combined arms warfare, the seamless cooperation of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power. On Okinawa, this coordination reached its peak. Shermans advancing with flamethrowers and engineers, Corsair and Hellcat fighters strafing ridgelines, and artillery pounding bunkers in perfect timing. The synergy turned the tide of every engagement. What had once been chaotic island assaults in 1942 became orchestrated, mechanized destruction by 1945. The Marines, the Navy, and the Army had learned how to make war not just with courage, but with precision. For Japan, the Sherman's arrival in the Pacific marked a deeper realization, the end of its technological dominance. In 1941, Japan's Zero fighters, Chiha tanks, and warships were the envy of Asia. By 1945, all of them were obsolete. American industry, symbolized by the Sherman, had overwhelmed them. Japan could no longer match production, replacement, or innovation. In a single month, U.S. factories produced more Shermans than Japan-built tanks during the entire war. The psychological impact was devastating. Yet for all its power, the Sherman was never invincible. Tankers who fought through the Pacific knew its weaknesses well: the thin armor, the tendency to ignite when hit, the limited gun range compared to European tanks. Many crews called it the Ronson, after the lighter slogan, "Lights every time." On Iwo Jima, one tank took 7 direct hits before catching fire. On Okinawa, another survived a mine explosion only to be destroyed by a suicide charge moments later. But despite those losses, the Sherman's strength was never in perfection. It was in persistence. That persistence lived on after 1945. As new wars erupted in Korea and beyond, the Sherman, now upgraded to the M4A3E8 EZ-8, continued to fight. In the hills of Korea, its guns roared again, this time against Soviet-made T-34s. Around the world, the Sherman became the workhorse of newly independent nations. France used them in Indochina, Israel in the Sinai, and even Japan, rebuilt and allied with the United States, trained with post-war Shermans as part of its new self-defense forces. But for the men who fought in them, the Sherman's legacy was more personal. Many veterans described their tanks not as machines, but as comrades, living entities that shared their fear and endurance. A Marine gunner named Joe Peterson once said, "You never forgot the sound. The engine had this deep growl. You'd hear it even in your dreams. When it stopped, you prayed it was because we'd made it, not because she was dead." On Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa, wrecks of Shermans still lie and rusting in the jungle, their turrets half buried in coral and vines. They have become memorials, monuments, not to victory alone, but to the endurance of the men who drove them. Tourists and historians still find bullet holes in their sides, scorch marks from flamethrowers, and faded names painted by crews long gone. The lessons of the Sherman endure in military doctrine even today. Its amphibious modifications laid the foundation for modern marine armor tactics. Its flamethrower variants inspired post-war combat engineering vehicles, and its role in amphibious warfare directly influenced the design of modern armored personnel carriers and assault vehicles that continue to define U.S. Marine operations. Strategically, the Sherman proved that no weapon succeeds in isolation. It must evolve, adapt to terrain, to enemy, to necessity. In the Pacific, that adaptability became the decisive factor. Against Japan's rigid defense and limited industrial base, the Sherman's flexibility was fatal. It could swim, burn, climb, and survive. It could do what no other tank in the world could do: invade from the sea, fight in a jungle, and still come home. In the end, the M4 Sherman was remembered for not how many battles it won, but how it made victory possible. On every island where its treads turned, it carried more than armor and ammunition. It carried the industrial might, the ingenuity, and the will of an entire nation. When the Pacific fell silent and Japan lay in ruins, the Sherman stood as the embodiment of that truth, that wars are not won by the strongest or the fastest, but by those who never stop moving forward. In the jungles and beaches of the Pacific, it had proven one last thing: that sometimes the machine built for war can also become the monument to endurance, courage, and the price of victory.